Welcome to JF with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we are here with Jordan Rosenblum, Professor of Religious Studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Jordan, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, if I were to think of the single most taboo ritual in Judaism, and this is something that even, I live in California, you live in Wisconsin, I'm guessing these aren't beacons of, extremely traditional Jewish communities, but oftentimes when I talk to Jews, the one taboo that they're sort of, the most loath to part with is eating pork. So, in other words, Jews who won't hesitate to get in a car and drive on Shabbat, don't really care if their meat is kosher, certainly aren't practicing any of Jewish marital laws, but pork is a red line. And that's really interesting, because when you go into, I don't know, the Torah or even really the Mishnah and Talmud, pork is talked about, but especially from the Torah's point of view, pork is no better or worse than, a myriad of other things. And, if we want to get very technical, breaking Shabbat is actually considered more taboo, according to the Torah than pork. So let's start with there, how did pork go from, one out of a long list of things that you shouldn't do to sort of the essentialized, Jewish taboo of Jews do not eat pork?
So you're right. That's exactly, and that's where I sort of start the book of if all you had was the Torah, the fact that you could write a whole book on the subject would make no sense, right? We were just talking about the fact that I have a young child. You have a young child, and I point out in the first chapter that there's this moment of having these children's blocks that my mom got me, and they were Hebrew blocks. And then my wife grew up in Italy, so I got these Italian blocks, and I was looking at them, and they have animals on them and letters and words and numbers in Hebrew and Italian. And I was comparing them, the same company, then they had the same animals and the different words for them in Hebrew and Italian. But I realized suddenly they didn't have the pig in the Hebrew one, but they had it in the Italian one. So then I went to see what did they replace, because it's the same number of blocks. And they replaced in the Hebrew, they got rid of the pig, but they replaced it with the camel, which if all you had was the Bible makes no sense, because the same verses that kick out the pig kick out the camel, right? So it's not the Bible. The Bible, as you say, there's lots of other things you get put to death for. You don't get put to death for these. They just say, don't do it. God's not happy with it, right? It starts in the Second Temple period, where people think of the story of Hanukkah, and they think of the Maccabees and the miracle of the oil, but we don't learn about the story of the miracle of the oil until the Babylonian Talmud, hundreds of years later. But in the earliest book of the Maccabees, they talk a lot about these Jews who were forced to either eat pig or be murdered. And suddenly it seems to mean something more internally and externally to Jews and non-Jews. And then in Mishnah and Talmud, you start to see it's more where they talk more and more about it. And then what I argue is over time, it starting in the Second Temple period, but every generation beyond starts to notice it, both Jews and non-Jews, more and more and more. And it means more and more and more. And so it's a story that unfolds over 2,000 years. So you're right, it doesn't start there, but it continues to add on over time.
And the rabbis end up using pig as also a metaphor for, indecent action, right? So they even take this metaphor further than it's not just, don't eat bacon or don't eat pork in the morning, but don't be the essence of pork and of a pig. And so, in the famous, statement in rabbinic literature, they say, what's so bad about pork? Well, to be kosher, a mammal needs two things, right? Split hooves and chewing its cud. And a pork, which only has split hooves, the rabbis say the pork, the pig is going around saying, I'm kosher, where, on the inside, it's not kosher, but, who knows that, no one's going to dissect the animal. And so the rabbis essentially build this whole metaphor out of, don't be a pig. This obviously, in modern Yiddish, it's sort of an insult to say that somebody's a pig. I recall, because I'm teaching right now in one of my classes, a course on Jewish law, a lot about the Spanish Inquisition. And I remember coming across a couple of articles that talked about pigs in, one of the things, I guess I'll take a step back. I went to Barcelona with my wife exactly a year ago. We spent spring break there. And I had known this, intellectually, but I was shocked by just the ubiquity of pork products within, Spain. It made for very difficult eating as somebody who keeps kosher. And so I looked into this, and I don't know if this happened, pre-Inquisition. I'm curious to run this by you, but it seems like there was at least one idea that because there were a lot of Jews who maybe were, Jews in private, but publicly were, proclaiming their adherence to Christianity, but those Jews still wouldn't eat pork. So all of a sudden it became a much bigger cuisine in Spain in the 1500s of, the ubiquity of pork. And I'm curious if you can shed some light on that, because I think that's also a part of this big story.
Right. So this is part of a common theory goes that, so if you look at Inquisition records, right, there are all these people who were horribly tortured on being accused of not eating pig, and so it becomes a way of that. Right, the term for a converso or a new convert to Christianity, a pejorative term is a marano, which means pig, right? Which is sort of a ironic thing to say. I think it's drawing on that same midrash that you're talking about looking kosher on the outside, but being treif, being not kosher on the inside, um, and the idea of this certain there's a hypocrisy there, right? And so claiming of you're pretending that you are a Christian, but you're internally you're corrupt and you're being Jewish. But one way to show how Christian you are was to portray pork, right? Put a pig carcass right there. And I think and it's a common theory, and I think it sort of holds because we have so many texts. I said several in the book of where people say, "Look how much pig I'm eating. Look how Christian I am. Look at a good Christian I am." And so, again, if pig is symbol, what's more symbolic than looking in my window and seeing a huge pig carcass, right? And saying, look how not Jewish I am, right? And then it becomes part of an identity as a culture that also it understands itself as a very Catholic culture, right? So, and then there are all there's evidence that we have of people talking about how to show what a good Catholic you are, you should eat pork, you should display pork, right? So, and that's what you're still seeing today. And I think today there are people who do it not knowing that because for them it's just tradition, right? It's this. What is a if you close your eyes, you were just saying like, and I say imagine a street in a medieval looking street in Barcelona. You're going to imagine a butcher shop with a pig carcass, right? So it becomes what is seen as quote unquote authentic for that, right? And without people necessarily thinking of the history to it and why it came to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I feel like it even jives well with, the early Christian slash Paul's criticism of law in general, right? If sort of
Mhm.
the pig is the epitome of symbol of Jewish ritual law,
Right.
and then, Paul is saying that law is now obsolete or
Mhm.
unnecessary or perhaps even shackling in all the ways that,
Right.
he writes, pig might become that, classic test case. And what's interesting is,
Mhm.
this I think even goes to the modern American Jewish community. So sort of,
Right.
one of the most interesting, I think, meals in Jewish history was this, treifa banquet, and I believe in
Mhm.
the 1880s. And just to give
Mhm.
listeners a little bit of background, then I'll let you fill in if I get anything wrong. This is the first ordination class of any American rabbinic school, which was associated with the Reform movement. I think it was the first rabbinic school in general. And to celebrate the graduating class of rabbis, they had this array of non-kosher foods. But interestingly enough, pork was actually not on the menu.
Yep.
And so even the early reformers who sort of had this idea of, okay, well, the Mosaic law is no longer necessary and we just care about the moral law and we want
Mhm.
to, make a more Protestant-like version of Judaism to fit in better
Mhm.
in, first Germany and then America. Even they, seem to get a little bit squeamish around pork. I don't know if you have anything to add about the banquet in particular.
Yeah, no, I mean, it points to one of the. It's funny. One of the reviewers of my book, the early reviewers, uh, basically felt that I was lauding Jews who ate pork, and I sort of find that criticism funny because my whole point is not to laud it, but to say that there's a variety of Jewish experiences with the pig. And those who choose to eat it, those who choose not to eat it, those who choose to kind of sometimes occasionally eat it. And what I'm arguing is that all of those are Jewish stories of Jewish identity. And so I'm not saying one is better or worse. What I'm saying is all of them need to be part of the discussion. And I think that argument alone was too much for that person. And so I say that to get to this is when people think of the Trefa banquet, if they're familiar with it, they think, oh, all these non-kosher foods were served. Um, Ignoring the fact at first that pork wasn't there, but there were, frogs' legs, there were clams, there were, I think, 5 different types of biblically non-kosher foods. And and yet pork was too much. And in fact, there's a lot written about how oysters were allowed at that time, but Reform Judaism at that point was pork was too far. It was, you called it a red line. I mean, maybe we should say it's a pink line, right? It's just too far, right? And then Reform Judaism at that time was debating it. And then a few years later, there's the Pittsburgh Platform, and Reform Judaism, at least officially at that time, says nope, all of it, including pig. And then there's been complex changes over Reform Judaism over time. And again, making a broad statement about any Jewish community is always problematic because there's variance because humans are messy and difficult to pin down. But looking back at that, even that quintessential moment, the fact that even at the moment where a stance was being made, right, about what their definition of Judaism was, how they were going to understand and practice Judaism, and they were making a stance that they understood would be viewed by many. And there's reports of people who walked out. They were on board with the reform agenda until that moment that they served non-kosher food. They said, nope, too much, right? So there were people who still at that moment were making their decision at the meal, right? And after they sat down to eat, and then they stood up and walked out. And even then, when there was an act that was meant to make a difference and to take a stance, pig was too far. And why that is, the power of that is a fascinating story. No problem eating clams, frogs' legs, but pig. Why? It doesn't make any sense. Again, we're winding to the biblical story.
Yeah,
But
no, but I think your theory then of both the Maccabees and then through, Talmudic times and then also, the Inquisition, I mean, it seems to make a lot of sense where if this was the epitome of clinging to not just Jewish practice, but Jewish identity. I mean, the thing that I
right,
always try to stress to, I'm teaching a class right now, the history of Jewish law. And, it's very hard if people, all they know about the Jewish community is the American Jewish community in 2025. Because then if I
right,
say Jewish law has always been central to Jewish identity, they look at me and they're like, okay, but that's not true. That's not true in 2025 in America. But
mhm,
at any period before the 1800s, it would have been true. Obviously, Jews had debates about internal
mhm,
legal things. What was kosher? What was not kosher? Why are we keeping kosher? Is this a rational set of rules, or is this just, what the Talmud calls, chukim, just sort of, random
mhm,
ordinances with no rhyme or reason? But everyone would have been bought into this general system. And so,
right,
it makes sense that that could be a step too far of, okay, the laws of Shabbat, they're vast and they're complex and whatever, but like pork is such an obvious in your face, thing right there. And, it just dawned on me, one of my favorite chapters of Jewish history, because it's, wild, is the period of, Jacob Frank and,
mhm,
he was an 18th century, just for listeners, he was, a false messiah very much in the, on the tailcoats of Shabtai Tzvi, another earlier false messiah. And one of the philosophies that he put forward was a specific and public breaking of Jewish law because according to, originally Shabtai Tzvi's view and then Jacob Frank's view, that's what you actually need to redeem in order to bring about the Messiah. But one of
mhm,
the things that Jacob did, he also held all these fascinating orgies and whatever, just to, in case people are listening, interested in digging further. But he also, I think he would publicly eat pork as sort of a message of, I am no longer bound by the, normative, law of
right.
Judaism. This is an antinomian movement there that, it is interesting that even the early reformers who are called antinomian, I don't view, I mean, maybe I don't know, but I can't imagine, or maybe he was Abraham Geiger. I mean, was he eating pork? It's sort of hard to imagine him eating pork.
Right. It is very hard to imagine. The interesting thing about all of these stories is how easy pork serves as an easy metaphor for Jewish identity, right? You want to say, I'm a Jew eating pig. Suddenly, it's right. If he said, okay, we're gonna eat camel, it wouldn't have been his name. If he said, if I'm gonna eat shrimp, if I'm gonna eat clams, you could go down the list. It's not as impactful, right? And so what you find, and I see it really particularly starting with Shabbatai Tzvi, but you see this Franken moving on, or and particularly with Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment Jews who want to argue for radical ruptures or radical reinterpretations of Judaism. Often a shorthand for that is like is to interact with the pig, to eat the pig, to use it to Shabbatai Tzvi had there were accusations that his followers would on Sabbath eat pig ritually, right? And that becomes a really concrete way of pushing for something different. Or there's a lot of stories of Jews talking about eating pork on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. We're not supposed to eat, and all the more so eating pig, right? But using it still to transgress, but to transgress Jewishly. They're still doing a practice that's points back to Judaism on a day that points back to Judaism to claim some complicated Jewish identity, right? And that's fascinating. I'm not saying it's good or bad. As I said, that reviewer would want me to say it's bad. I refuse to say it's bad. I'm also not saying it's good. It's interesting. And it talks to the complex ways different Jews have tried to stake a claim on Jewish identity.
Yeah, I love it. So oftentimes in personal conversations, I am willing to go more into a normativity of saying, at least from my perspective,
Right.
good or bad. So one example that has rung to mind, and I don't know why this is always a favorite pet example of people starting to learn about kosher, is this question of, whether or not you can eat chicken and cheese together, right? Just
Yes.
for listeners, I know you wrote an article on this, so, I'll bring that up in a second.
Hmm.
Just the 2 second, background for listeners. I mean, the Torah never even explicitly says don't eat meat and milk. It says don't boil a calf in its mother's milk. There was some ancient debate even before the Talmud about is that literal or is that general?
Right.
The rabbis obviously go general. So sorry, no In-N-Out burgers for people listening, according to the rabbinic reading of the Torah. But then there's this inter-Talmudic debate about, cheese and fish, which obviously
Mm.
that's how the mainstream Jewish community has ruled for the last 1800 years because, you might, it's sort of unclear why, but, the reason that ends up trickling down to a 21st century, you ask your average traditional rabbi as well, you might mix up, the steak and chicken, which has always seemed a little bit ridiculous. And so I'll oftentimes have students, who will specifically, if I'll be out to lunch with them, they'll order like a chicken parm and they'll say, do you think what I'm doing is bad? And I'm like, the very fact that you're asking this and you're sort of delving into like the Talmudic background, I love this. If you were just eating this and, not thinking about it at all, then I'd say
Mhm.
like, okay, maybe it's not good or bad, but you're not having a Jewish moment. You actually specifically eating, chicken and cheese together while thinking about the Talmudic debate in
Right.
this, like, that's Jewish enough for me. So, I
Hmm.
think it's interesting. I don't know if I'd go far enough to say, then Shabtai Tzvi's eating pork on Yom Kippur is also,
Right.
an authentic Jewish practice, but it is probably in some way better than if you are Jewish and you just have never really thought deeply about why you do what you do and you're just eating whatever and you have no connection to the practice at all. So I don't know, a little bit of
Well, it also comes from different places in a sense, right? Like, by the way, the interesting thing about the whole, chicken and cheese thing is there are well-known rabbis who, like Akiva, right, and Yossi the Galilean, who, if you read a Passover Haggadah, like he appears there, right, and who clearly say, nope, not a problem. It says don't boil the kid in its mother's milk. There's no mother's milk for chicken, right? There's no fowl has no mother's milk, so you can't violate it, right? So that's the interesting thing there. There's an interpretation there that's a different stance. I would say a different identity stance than saying I recognize this is a violation and I'm choosing to do it to violate, as opposed to I disagree on the interpretation of this. I think I'm still in compliance with biblical law and doing this. Right? There's the action might outwardly appear the same, but the justification for it is radically different.
sure. And slash but there is a at least attempted justification. Like in
Yeah.
both of those cases, people are trying to think about it Jewishly. Obviously, what Jewishly means is
Hmm.
very different.
Right.
That might be different than, obviously in 2025 in a place like Southern California, the vast, not the vast majority, but I would say the majority of Jews I meet on a daily basis on campus maybe aren't eating pork, but they won't hesitate to get a cheeseburger. And that's not from any specific philosophic, oh, I disagree with this or whatever. It's just, oh, I had never thought about this. And that's where, I think it's interesting to challenge
Mhm.
people and
Right.
say, hey, there are, believe it or not, Jewishly sanctioned ways to
Right.
argue that a cheeseburger is kosher. I mean, one of my favorite lines in the Talmud is that, a judge in the ancient court would actually have to come up with 49 different rationales to make a sheretz, which is a category of non-kosher bug, kosher. And so you think, how can you come up with 49 reasons that a cheeseburger is kosher? I don't know. I guess they had to do it. I
Mhm.
do want to go back to,
Yeah.
pork for 1 second because
Sure.
this is always, an interesting question that people ask, and I've never really had a good answer for them. So, who better to ask than the person who wrote the book on it? What are the current theories as to, why in the ancient world Jews didn't eat pork? I mean, do we have any, obviously it's sort of
Mhm.
impossible to know, but, yeah, what are some of the dominant theories there?
Okay, so I will start to say that I'm a bit of a buzzkill in that I firmly believe that none of these theories hold water. I believe that if you look at all the evidence, it simply says because God says so, right? And there are groups in this region that also tabooed pigs, and there are groups in this region that didn't taboo pigs. So every other theory besides the fact that we don't know, is flawed. So I'm just going to begin with that long thing, and that's why I say I think it's important to look. I start getting more interested in the Second Temple period, where you then have people that say, "Okay, so you can't, but what does that mean?" Then you start getting interesting explanations. Now, the common theories have been like the Mary Douglas School, which is an anthropologist who wrote in the 60s about the idea that it's matter out of place. Like these are the anomalous things, right? The domesticated quadruped that doesn't chew the cud or have split hooves is and more anomalous. Like most of them have your cows, your sheep, your goats are much more common. Same thing with all the other animals. I talk about aquatic creatures that have fins and scales, which is the biblical requirement. Those that don't are anomalous. That's great, except it's kind of circular reasoning because who's to just how do you know that they were considered the dominant one when there's tons of these creatures around, right? There's another anthropologist who claimed that it was about the environment and that it's hard to have pigs in that environment. And that's true, except some did do it. And just because it's hard to have it doesn't mean that you have to have such a deep legislation against it, right? And there are some people, there's a claim about trichinosis, which actually holds no water because no one talks about it until trichinosis is discovered, right? And then suddenly people, what you really get is Reform Jews in Germany saying, look, this is so rational. There's a rational reason. They're trying to argue that Judaism is rational, right?
For the medically unacquainted, can you define trichinosis?
Okay, so if you don't cook pork through enough, if you leave it raw, then you can get sick from eating it. And I'm going to avoid saying all the intricacies, so I don't want to make a mistake and have some biologist, because it's always you make some mistake and some biologist comes through and says you didn't express that wrong. So I'll just simply say, if you cook pork all the way through, it kills stuff in there. And that stuff, if it's not killed, can get in you and kill you. And they discover, and then looking under microscopes, they discovered this as part of broader germ theory. And then Reformed Jews in Germany tried to say, "Oh, look, we've discovered that's what this is about."
And this is, I mean, essentially, Moses Maimonides does the same thing 800 years before, where, I mean, he probably didn't know about, trichinosis.
Well, no, he was using Galenic theory. He's using like old, Greek and Roman thought about humors in the body and such. So it was not quite the same thing, but he was saying but even still, let's say Maimonides is saying that. Maimonides is writing 2,000 years after that time, right? So
Sure.
So what you're saying, and also you're assuming that everyone else who ate pork were complete morons and didn't do the math on that, right? And as an anthropologist, Marvin Harris has pointed out, then the law shall be, thou shalt not eat pork that's pink in the center, right? So it's great, except there's no evidence for it. And if your evidence for something that happened,
they were trying to save ink in Deuteronomy
right.
there.
Well, right, but if your evidence is that if you're going to try and throw Maimonides in it, he's writing so much later than it. So right,
sure. I was more bringing up Maimonides that there is this 900-year-old legacy of trying to rationally explain away things that simply in the ancient world you would have to say either could God said so or makes no logical sense, right? So, Maimonides sort of paved the way for those 1800s and 1900s thinkers of saying, see, this is a longstanding Jewish tradition. But there is, I mean, one of the, taglines, because when I look this up, a lot of the articles, default to talking about, health reasons and, pork is dirtier and whatever. And so even if, health was never really an a priori concern for kashrut, and, I'll go broad, right? Jews also have, this idea you wash your hands before you eat. And there's also, with the menstrual cycle, purity rituals of a woman going, bathing in water and, dipping herself in a mikvah once a month. Even if there was the a priori reason wasn't health, it was the case, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that Jews were more protected from, say, diseases in, the medieval period because of a lot of these rituals. So even if it wasn't the reason, there is some research that seems to say that, washing before eating and dunking in the mikvah and not eating certain animals that seem more unclean might have actually, saved Jewish lives in the medieval period.
This is when I ask if you want me to kill Santa Claus for you or not. Because I firmly disagree with that, because I mean, there's been a lot of research that talks about like Black Plague, and this is a common claim, but ignoring the fact that number one, plenty of Jews died in equal numbers in Black Plague. But there was also a lot of social separation, and we've all just been through a time where we understand during a time of plague what the benefits of social separation, right? So I think that maybe a little bit, but I think that the evidence for that is way overplayed. And actually, this is where I go back to, like, my primary training is in rabbinics, like the classic rabbinic Mishnah, Talmud. And if you read those texts about the kosher laws, the rabbis actually very explicitly want to say these are chukim, right? These are laws, and you should do them because God said so. They do try and give explanations for it, because even though when they say we don't need an explanation, but we'll still give some. But still, the fundamental practice was that it was because they rejected rationality. For a scholar, Christine Hayes, has written about this in a recent book. Right? They rejected that Second Temple Jews were embracing. We're talking about the Maccabees, where they're embracing this rationality behind it, Philo and others expecting rationality. The rabbis explicitly reject it to say, no, it's not because there's a rational reason, it's because God says so. So they actually fundamentally reject that. And so kind of push it away from that. And when I see people doing that, I guess I'm also reacting because I have internalized that to say, like, well, I think there's more to, and I think that what you end up with all of these theories is there's evidence to support and there's evidence to contradict. And depending on what your ultimate goal is, you will either accent the evidence. So there's some evidence that points to that. I don't think there's enough. But it's grand claim made on small evidence. And therefore, I guess I react to that to say, but it doesn't prove enough as much as what people would want to, and it doesn't account for all the evidence of it. So I think maybe for some, but not all. And so to the extent to which that proves it, and again, this comes back to, I don't think that's even the point. The point is that because those who were doing it were not doing it for those reasons. They were doing it because they believed. Well, again, let me be careful here. Many believed they were doing that because for pious reasons. There's a variety of reasons. People could have been doing it because they knew that their mother or father would be upset if they didn't. People were doing it because they knew it would be awkward in the community. Right? Knowing the exact reason is always difficult too. But I guess I am more inherently suspicious of those claims because looking into it, the evidence I would want the evidence to more clearly prove that than it does.
That is perfectly fair. I do want to, eventually end with talking about the modern kashrut industry in, America 2025. But before we go there, only because my wife and I both read your article about breast milk and rabbinic literature last night. I have a 3.5-month-old at home, so we're very much within the, I'll pick the Talmudic word, the sugya of, breast milk and breastfeeding. You make a couple of interesting claims that all seem to, check out, just to go through some of them, and then you can sort of double click on whichever. One, and this is something that I actually I don't know if I didn't know or I never fully realized that, according to the Mishnah, that feeding the child is not something that the mother owes the child, it's something that the mother owes her husband, which gets all sorts of into, interesting marital law and contracts. And so, that was just one claim that sort of stuck to me. The other is that the rabbis, just like, most of the ancients thought that breast milk was the same as menstrual blood, just repurposed. So the rabbis are sort of, very interested in this because menstrual blood, just for listeners' background, is sort of one of the most impure fluids you can possibly have. And breast milk then should be impure, but obviously you need it to, nourish and save the baby's life. So, the rabbis play around with that. But you sort of go broader, and, I'll ask you to outline the thesis in a second, but you claim that breast milk is just a good substance to think about generalities of law. For somebody that has never thought about Judaism and breast milk in the same sentence, could you give that thesis?
Yeah, so sure. So just like I started thinking about this because I had a child, as I'm wont to do. I think, well, what do the rabbis have to say about this? And it's not something I had looked too much into. And so I started to look into it, and what I found is exactly as you said, that breast milk is really fascinating because the rabbis the standard journalistic claim is when you hear hoofbeats, I think horses, not zebras. The rabbis are the opposite. They want to think zebras, not horses, because the obvious question is not interesting to them. If it's a clear, simple yes or no, it's not interesting to them. As I often say to my son, like the rabbinic debate that they would love is a hot dog a sandwich. Now that is a rabbinic debate, right? Because immediately people have strong opinions and are ready to argue with it. And that's a great rabbinic day. And so the breast milk it's produced by a non-normative rabbinic figure, right? Adult free men, normative rabbinic figure. So you're dealing with women. For another non-normative rabbinic figure, an infant. for a brief period of time, that's important too, because it's not long. It's so there are different rules if something's forever versus for a short period of time. And for that brief period of time, it is absolutely vital for life. Like there's all these debates today is formula versus breastfeeding, but forgetting the stakes of it are kind of ridiculous when you're an historian and say that's only for the past like 150 years is really at most is when the option was either way the child will live, right? But prior to that, you either need the biological mother to feed the child, someone else who has breast milk to feed the child, or the child will die. Like life or death, legit. Not, this will they get a 1580 on their SAT or a 1420, right? Like the stakes are radically different. And so the rabbis then think it's so interesting, and it's they use it to think of variables. So one variable is, as you pointed out, forgive me for a second. Menstrual blood is the most tabooed bodily fluid in the Hebrew Bible and subsequently in the Talmud. And menstrual blood is the most tabooed of the most tabooed. And the rabbis, along with, this was, Galenic, they're back to Greek and Roman medical thought. This was, Aristotle writes about this. You have this early Christians write about this. If you were trained in the West in medical school until the 17th century, you would have been taught this, that menstrual blood is transformed into breast milk. And if you step back for a second, it makes a certain empirical sense. If you don't know anything about what you can find today in Wikipedia, right, and you look and say, well, a woman gets pregnant, before you had, before you could go to Walgreens and get a quick pregnancy test, the first sign you'd have is menstruation ceases, right? Like obviously, and then after a child's born, menstruation doesn't immediately begin again, and when it does, when the onset of menstruation again, usually coincides with a reduction in breast milk production, right? So there's a certain logical, and both are seen as unique to women. There's all these reasons why you connect it. So then the obvious question is all the rules of that associated to it, but how could they if the child needs it to live? So that's why all those laws come. And then it's really, and I still don't know why they chose it, because it was clear there was no reason to have chosen that, right? In fact, there's actually a strong reason to have not, where the idea is that a biological father is obligated to feed his own child. A wife is obligated to feed the child of her husband. Were they to get divorced, she has no obligation to feed her own biological child. The rabbis easily could have solved this, so they don't explain where they get the justification.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. So I was reading that last night, and I was sitting next to.
It makes no sense.
No, it makes no sense. And I was sitting next to my wife, and we were reading it, and we came across that line. And I had spent years in yeshiva studying Talmud, and I was like, I'm going to go find this. So I was there, typing, and then tried ChatGPT. That didn't work, and I was where did the rabbis get this from? And so I'm glad you said that makes no sense, because I was going to ask you where they got that from also.
Yeah, it makes no sense, and I still, that's something I still struggle with, and because it makes no sense, because the obvious thing would just obligate the biological mother. It's straightforward. Or, I'm not even looking what the modernist in me would say, like, make it egalitarian, like both parents are obligated.
No, but even not the modernist, right? Like when you open the Tanakh and you look at stories of breastfeeding, there was never the father telling the wife, now go breastfeed. It was, Sarah is able to breastfeed, and Hannah is able to breastfeed, and, Moses's mother is, eventually able to breastfeed. There was no like Amram sitting there being, or, you never have the husband saying, so it just seems like it even goes the obvious read and creates so many problems.
Yeah, and that is one thing I never solved. I don't know why, because it didn't make sense, and it doesn't, like it was but because they make that decision, it was like they made a bad decision in my mind, but then they kept to it. So that's why, like in the text I talk about, they'll say, so if they get divorced, if the child would have recognized her, which all scientific studies show that very quickly, an infant will sense the smell of their mother. Like there are all these easiest ways that it would recognize. Of course, like this is the person who's been breastfeeding them, right? Like, so of course their child is going to recognize their mother. Then the mother's treated like a wet nurse, basically, which is a fix for a problem that we don't have to have, right? So that is one thing I've never been able to wrap my head around. And I did do a deep dive, and I could never find out why, and I still don't know why. My best guess is just that they decided that was the way they wanted it to be, and then they came up with that was a solution that solved it, no matter what.
Interesting. So I want to stay on this theme of young children for a second because
Sure.
obviously very relevant to my life. I'll make a public announcement. We did not do this, but there is a big millennial and Gen Z push, whether it's
Mhm.
actually medically helpful
Mhm.
or just customary for eating the placenta. And
Mhm.
so I decided to look into this halakhically, and sometime around the birth of our daughter. And there have been some recent responses written about whether or not the placenta is kosher. But I figured I would ask you, if somebody asks you, what halachic considerations, I don't know if the rabbis
Mhm.
dealt with this, but what would you say, is eating a
Mhm.
placenta kosher?
Okay, so this is the one thing I like to talk to students about. Is like I try and zoom out because I also teach, of course, that work with our pre-law programs and things. I said, let's zoom out to any legal system. And what the rabbis are big into is what actually all legal systems are, is categorization. So I have to ask, so the answer I always say is that we have to begin with it depends, right? Um, so I need to ask some questions. So what I would want to do is look at the medical literature and see what is the benefit of it. What is the data? So if, for example, if you could if you, here's the easy answer. If you prove that will have a tangible impact on the viability of that, like parents who eat that, though, if a mother eats it and she therefore produces breast milk that leads to 25% higher likelihood that that child will thrive and live, I think that halakhically there would be a very strong basis to, if that's the easy one, right? I'm going to do a reverse rabbi. I'll start with the easy ones. Like if you can show that it will have a tangible benefit on the likelihood that the child will live and thrive, right? Especially if you go back in time, how many times you'd have to have the parent, a father or mother would have to have about 6 children to ensure that they would have 2 that live to adulthood, right? So with that kind of a life expectancy, there's a strong push to, right. So, but even just generally, if you can if you can show that it will really have an impact on the life of a child, meaning that the child will live and thrive, and not get into the school they want, not their safety school, but I mean like thrive, like really actually have a physically robust life, then I think that's not a problem. But if you're getting into the murky waters of why, then it gets dicier. And I haven't looked. I read an article or two also when I was at that stage. We didn't. I had no interest in it either. But I felt that the nothing that I read convinced me that there was anywhere near as enough evidence to suggest that it. So then you're getting into the really murky water, and I would just fall in the why. And if someone felt it was important for a variety of other reasons, well, then you'd have to investigate what those reasons were and decide what your interpretation of halakha is. And gets to one of my biggest bugbears that my family knows about, because it drives me nuts when people talk about, oh, so and so has a higher level of a kashrut, or they're stricter in the kosher laws. And I hate those terms. Or I say they have a different interpretation of, right? And so this is what I say: depending on one's interpretation of halakha, um, I could find you reasons why you could say yes or no. But I think the strongest case across the board would be if life is profoundly impacted in a
Okay, so
positive way.
speaking about different interpretations or stricter, I won't
Yeah.
use those terms, even though I was about to literally ask a question using those terms. I will
So now,
rework the
yeah, go
question.
ahead.
I will go ahead and you can add that to the, this person really upset me on the podcast. No, but, I remember when I was studying, in rabbinic school and learning the, all the Talmudic debates about Basar B'chalav, right? The,
Meat and
sections
milk.
dealing with the laws of kosher, just for listeners. One of the things that struck me as somebody who grew up, in a normative modern Orthodox community is how much stricter
Yeah.
21st century Orthodox kashrut was than Talmudic kashrut. And usually it
Yep.
works the opposite, because when I studied, I'll just give another example. When I studied the laws of Shabbat, my conclusion was, oh my goodness, none of us are actually keeping Shabbat, right? Because the rabbis, the rabbinic system of the laws of Shabbat are very strict in terms of,
Right.
even the way you cut vegetables is sort of,
Yeah.
you can't cut vegetables a certain way. No one in the modern Orthodox community is, worrying about cutting cucumbers too small on Shabbat and mixing a salad in a certain way and squeezing lemon, all of that. But then you get into the laws of kosher and you read these, Talmudic debates after debate, if somebody was roasting a pig in an oven and then you popped in your kosher chicken next to it,
Yeah.
is that chicken kosher? And, I'm thinking, if I had brought pig even in the, even in my front door, my mom would probably have thrown out the entire kitchen, and so,
But yeah.
one of the big historic
Hmm.
theories, I think Chaim Soloveitchik puts forth this theory, is that in the medieval Ashkenazi period, you had
Yeah.
this sort of, you had this, Hasid, this pious ascetic movement, probably born out of a lot of, anti-Jewish persecution by, Christians in France and Germany, which sort of led to this almost arms race of, what's called in Hebrew chumras for listeners of, strict
Stringencies. Yeah.
stringencies, yeah, piling on top of each other. But the modern kosher kitchen, seems a little bit crazy. And then it
Yeah.
also, you also have these other debates, and this is, I think, to your point of, not being stricter, but just different interpretations. Even, my wife is Persian, and so in, dominant Sephardic tradition, things like glass, of course, you don't need separate
Yeah.
glass plates for meat and milk. But in the Ashkenazi tradition, which tends to be much stricter, they said, no, glass, if you use it for meat, you can never use it
Hmm.
for milk. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that, because it's always struck me as weird. And I sort of have two minds on this. I'm kind of curious to run both of these by you.
Hmm.
One is, sort of the legal positivist, mind of me, which says, well, legal systems evolve. And, yes,
Right.
if I popped into a time machine to 4th century, Surah in Babylonia, maybe I could have, cooked my chicken next to my roommate's non-kosher chicken, and, the rabbis would have been fine with it. But law has just
Right.
evolved in such a way that, of course, now you
Hmm.
need two ovens and, two microwaves and, in a normative 21st century kosher. And my other mind is saying, well, this is ridiculous. We have, for whatever historic reasons, we sort of piled all these ridiculous stringencies, which not only is inconvenient for me, if I'm trying to, help other people understand, the rules of kosher, and say, I have students that don't come from a traditional background, and they say, this seems really interesting, having your entire diet revolve around, being more
Hmm.
mindful and authentic. I want to do it, but they have a non-kosher roommate. Part of me is like, you can actually fully keep kosher according to the Talmud without much budging.
Right.
But from a 21st century kosher perspective, you actually have no chance. And I'm curious to run those by
Right.
you in terms of, I don't even really have a question. I'm just curious to get
Right.
your thoughts here.
So yeah, so it radically changes, right? And even more so, as I often will point out that the kosher laws have changed more in the past 30 years than they have in the past 3,000, right? Like you look at, you know, in the 70s and early 80s, peanut oil was kosher at Passover without a problem. Some of the most, Rav Moshe Feinstein was a very well-known um, arbiter of halakha, of rabbinic law, doesn't have a problem with it. Nowadays, even amongst more liberal denominations, will not say that that's allowed. Right? It's radically changed, and it's changed for a variety of reasons. So, one of the reasons it's changed is due to technology. Right? So, there's a chapter of a book written by David Kramer, and he talks about how the that how this changes over time also relates to people don't have two sets of dishes. People don't have two yitzhaks. And when these things become more prevalent, right? You used to have one knife. And so taking your meat knife and just plunging it into the earth a couple times and saying, oh, it's not meaty anymore, right? Worked then. But when when technology and economy allows for you to have two knives, you say, well, maybe I'll make one of each. Right. And so things change over time. And then we've had technological explosion. Like take a look at the package of any food item, if that's in any way processed. And I often ask students and crowds, I say, what country is the largest producer of kosher foods today? And you get Israel, America, Argentina, Canada. You go along this, finally someone says, well, China? Like, yeah, actually, because how much of that is, this chemical additive, this flavoring and such. And in the modern kosher system that exists, for something to be certified, every ingredient also has to be certified. And if 20 of the ingredients, the ones that you can't pronounce, all need to be certified. They're produced often in a factory in China and then brought over to Italy so it can be quote unquote produced in Italy and then imported to America, right? Sometimes the producing right is just the ship stops in the port for a second and then comes over. So it's imported from Italy. And so so part of it is this technological story, all of that changing. And then part of it is a story of various internal politics for things, right? I haven't checked in a while, but it used to be that like on El Al, if you wanted a kosher meal, you had different types of kosher choices, right? So this is also what I mean about not level, right, but interpretation, because there'll be, multiple ultra orthodox communities will have different interpretation, and sometimes the interpretation is simply if Daniel is your Rav, you're going to want his name on the package. If I'm your rabbi, you're going to want my name on the package. And there are well-known plants in Israel that produce the same food with different packages. Just because if it's going to go to your neighborhood, it needs to have your hashgacha, your kosher certification on it, whereas my neighborhood wouldn't buy it, right? So part of it is that. But then a more positive thing is part of it is the system has radically changed. And so to not accommodate for it, one of the I'm gonna get there in a second, but I'm gonna go a little long. Another thing I often say to people is, how many of you heard of Hanukkah? And my students will always raise their hand. And I say, how many of you heard of Yom Nicanor? How many of you heard of Nicanor's Day? And no one raises their hand. I said, the same text that talks about Hanukkah talks about Nicanor's Day. But people forgot who Nicanor was, and they stopped being interested in it, and then it's forgotten, and so now no one knows. Hanukkah, as I pointed out, meant you learn more about the pig than you do oil in the most ancient texts. Then you learn about the miracle. Then you learn about this, and it becomes story after story, and generations reinterpret and means something differently to people, and it adds meaning, right? If it doesn't adapt and change with time, it gets forgotten. And the food system is so radical. All food system has radically changed in the past 30 years. Right? The ways food is produced and understood and distributed and marketed, et cetera, is so radically changed. So if there were no changes to the law, there would be no living, it would lose its sense to a living community. And even, we've been talking about different Jews debating what the kosher laws mean. That whole debate is about updating it and making it relevant to. And even if the relevance is fighting against, right? It's that if I say don't think of an elephant, the reason you always think of an elephant is something called ironic process theory, because your brain says, okay, if I say don't think of an elephant, you say, okay, I'm going to think of a water bottle. And your brain will say, is a water bottle an elephant? No. Okay, so I'm not thinking of an elephant. But I've had to think of an elephant to remember that I'm not thinking of an elephant, right? And so all of these debates are pointing back to it. So I don't know if that gets to your answer. Or I would say it's a variety of things to do with technology, but also humans' interaction with that.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, what I immediately shot to, this was a very lively debate amongst my friends and I a couple of years ago. I don't remember if it was Beyond or Impossible, but one of these vegan outlets made a pork, Beyond Pork or Impossible Pork, 100%
Impossible.
vegan. And it was either the OU or the Chaf K. I think it was the OU. Essentially refused to make it kosher, not because any of the ingredients were not kosher, but even going back to, I think, our first conversation, they had no problem, by the way, with, you go to any kosher restaurant now in New York or Los Angeles, meat restaurant, and they have, quote unquote cheeseburgers on the menu with vegan cheese. And, there seems to be no problem with that. But for some reason, having anything that, sounds like pork, was sort of off. I was talking to one of my friends this morning and said that I was going to do a podcast about, kosher and the history of kosher and everything. And he sort of, ironically, but he, didn't actually mean this ironically, said, ask him how much of the modern kashrut industry is really just a mafia. And, what he meant by that, that was his verbatim question. But you do get the sense, that there should be a lot more things in restaurants. You take a community like Irvine, California, which I live in. There is one kosher restaurant, it's meat that's quite expensive. But then, we're in California. There's 500 vegan restaurants. And, what it takes to make a vegan restaurant kosher is not much. You just need to worry about, the wine and vinegar and then maybe how exactly it's cooked. And maybe you need to check the vegetables for bugs. But these are, very, very easy things. There might be one or two more. But a lot of times, there is a lot of money interest within 21st century kashrut organizations. And so, I guess in the most basic way, talk to me about that, about, sort of the finances behind, you can either go
Right.
Israel or America, because it's also a major story in Israel. I
Right.
believe, the Rabbanut, which is the public, it is the
Hmm.
ultra Orthodox wing of the Israeli government, for lack of a better
Hmm.
word. So that is also a major way of raising
Right.
funds. Of if you want to open up your, falafel shop, which is the same falafel shop as every other falafel shop, which is of course kosher, you still have to go through them to get
Yep.
the correct certification. So, talk to me about money interest in kosher.
Right. Okay. So that's the classic. There's one question with 3,000 parts. So first, I want to talk about the impossible pork thing. I'm going to quote Rabbi Menachem Genack, who's the CEO of the OU. And so this is for those following along with my book at home. It's on page 175, where he's talking about impossible pork. And he says, the impossible pork we didn't give an OU, which is the Heksher, the kosher certification for the Orthodox Union, to it, not because it wasn't kosher per se. It may indeed be completely kosher in terms of its ingredients. By the way, this is editorial side comment. It is completely kosher in terms of ingredients, but is it's the same ingredients as the other things that they continue to certify, including impossible sausage. But that's a whole other story. If it's completely plant derived, it's kosher. It is. Just in terms of sensitivity to the consumer, it didn't get it. And by the way, the halal certifier did the same thing. Impossible pork was just seen as too much, right? But then you have to get beyond the fact that the modern kosher industry is dominated by OU and four other companies, right? And they kind of have a pact there. Let's take this at, I always say to students, let's begin with taking everything at its face value and taking everything with assuming that someone's claim to piety is 100% genuine and not self-interested. And the claim is, let's say that I'm your OU supervisor, you contract me to certify your food is kosher. And let's say you really are cheating, you're using fake kosher meat, and I discover that, and I drop you. They all have an agreement that if I drop you for a kashrut issue, for a kosher violation, none of the others will pick you up. Now, on the face of that, that actually makes pious sense to say, like, this is to so disincentivize someone from doing it, so that if they did it, they would never have a chance again. But as you can imagine, that also has the thing of effectively creating a monopoly to say, I can then say to you, we'll all agree this. So if you don't follow I just have to call it a kashrut. Now, I'm not saying that is the case. What I'm saying is that gives the perception of the potential for that, right? But then you also have to figure, when people think of the kosher industry, they think of it in terms of just for Jews. But about 1/12 of the market of people who buy kosher products, looking for it to be a kosher product, is only kosher observant Jews. The other 11/12 are other people. So someone who has the perception that it's healthier, that it treats animals better, that is lactose intolerant. So if it says that it's meat, they don't have to worry about dairy. You're a vegetarian, it says it's parv. Right? There's all of these reasons that people use that. That's actually, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Is that an actual statistic, by the way?
Yeah,
That let's just take
100%.
like Empire Chicken, that
Yep.
only about 10% of people who buy kosher chicken are doing it for halachic reasons.
Less than 10%.
That's really interesting.
Yes, because people, there's a perception that, again, it's false, that that kashrut means more ethically treating the animals. That means it's healthier. That means it's less disease ridden, et cetera, et cetera.
It means a higher sodium content. I can tell you that.
Right, but there's a perception of it, and this goes back to, think of the Hebrew National Campaign from the 1970s. We answer to a higher authority, right? Is making it implied all those things, and again, I'm not trying to besmirch people who the kashrut industry. I'm not trying to besmirch people who firmly believe that, and that's what I'm saying is that it has been marketed for that, and also there's a market external to it. And when you consider that's a multi-billion-dollar industry, that so many is for other factors, that I think when I'm talking to people about the kosher industry, they tend to think of it insularly as just for Jews. But I'm like, there's a much broader element to that. So when you're talking to talk about money, there's a lot to it. And by the way, you will market this, and other kosher companies will, because you will get a bump in sales by having a kosher symbol on it beyond the Jewish market, because
this
people are looking
this is,
for
I
it.
guess, part of the argument. I mean, the argument, not that I have sides in this, but if somebody was going to say that the kashrut industry now is sort of engaging in, mafia-like practices. I mean, you go to the store and parchment paper or aluminum foil now has an
Right.
OU. And this, it seems like, is sort of to your
Well,
exact point where,
but what I would say to that is, okay, this is one of those where I would want to ask you. So if you want, let me give you both sides of this, because you can actually, I will take a neutral stance on this, because actually I feel neutral in this. I think on the one hand, if you want to say it's a mafia-like stance, there's the argument for it. There's no reason they're bilking people. Here's the other stance, which is equally valid, by the way. You own an aluminum foil company. You're looking for ways to grow your market. I say, look, not just Jews, but non-Jews who know that symbol will associate that as a trademark, which is actually how it's enforced in America, right? You can't, because of the First Amendment, you cannot, you can't get involved in a lawsuit with that, and the government can't adjudicate it for business fraud based on the Establishment Clause. That's a problem, right? But if you say this is OU's trademark, this, we didn't give you the right to use that symbol, you've now violated my trademark. That's a thing, right? But if I say to you, look, it doesn't need it on your toothpaste, it doesn't need it on your aluminum foil, but if you put it there, it will cost you, let's say it'll cost you $10,000, but you're going to sell $100,000 more, right? So you could even be upfront. So that's why what I find is that people, what I'm saying is it's neutral. I think sometimes it's, if I'm being honest, I think that sometimes it is used for less than pious purposes, and other times it's just straightforward business. You will. And so I'm not going to take a stance on, like, I'm not paid by big kosher business. I'm not sponsored by them. I'm also not sponsored, right? So I'm not trying to take down or whatever, but I say both perspectives can be found. There are elements of, it's a big billion-dollar business. So will there be, piety and profit will be intention. But then there are other times where you can say, look, we think it's a wonderful thing and it will generate more profit for you. It's a write-off that you will make more money off of, right? So, and I think both can coexist, and sometimes one happens and sometimes the other. And that's the interesting thing. And the book I would recommend for that is there's Roger Horowitz wrote this book, Kosher USA, which is the single best book on the kosher industry in America. And I think he gives a really balanced view of the complexities of this, that show that it's complicated in a fascinating way. And that means some people took advantage of it, and it means some people saw an opportunity for what they perceive to be pious reasons.
yeah, one of the most interesting, this is somewhat of a non sequitur, but I think it connects in some way, interesting episodes of modern kosher, because I was living in Los Angeles when this happened, was the Doheny meat scandal, which, just for listeners' background, this is, a day or two before Passover. They essentially realized that they were sneaking in non-kosher meat and changing the labels, and it was this whole scandal. But then you have this problem where, thousands of families had purchased their meat for the, upcoming Passover Seder, and only realized the day before, or the day of Passover, that this meat was not kosher. And so the rabbis made a decision to, retroactively declare all of the meat that was purchased before a certain time kosher, which to me, I was in college when this happened. I was reflecting on this, and, what a fascinating iteration of, the way in which kosher might not actually be talking about, the physical essence of the food, but it almost is, and obviously, a lot of people's outside view of what kosher is blessed by a rabbi, which of course is the furthest thing ever from the truth.
Right.
But in this case, quite literally, that's what made that food kosher. Like, you were taking non-kosher food, and it was essentially not blessed as in, an actual blessing, but the rabbis were retrospectively saying, well, we have all these other concerns within the legal system, and one of it is, well, money and livelihood and people's happiness, and some percentage of people who, if they found out that wasn't kosher, probably would have eaten it anyway. And so the rabbis essentially made a decision, okay, we're declaring this non-kosher meat kosher. So I feel like that implicates a lot of these other ideas that we've been talking about. I know we've been talking for a while. I had a couple, I don't know if you want to respond to that, but there were, I wanted to try to almost do a lightning round of, just a couple of things that, other people fired at me. So you can send like, two or three sentences on each. The kashrut or lack thereof of strawberries and blueberries that have a lot of bugs on it.
Okay. So very quickly, this is not really an issue to the 1994-ish. There's an article that appears in the New York Times that says, oh, there's bugs in the water because people put water under the microscope. It's a long story. Again, if you, David Kramer has a book on, I forget the exact title, but Routledge published it. And it's just Google David Kramer and Jewish food and identity through the ages, something through the ages. But And he talks about this, where basically halakha has always been macroscopic, even after the microscope was invented. You have Maimonides talking about how worms in apples and things like the Talmud talks about bugs, which bugs in beer are kosher or not. Like, but this fear of blueberries, raspberries. Don't get me started on broccoli. By broccoli and cauliflower, I often tell students it's harder than meat and wine to declare broccoli kosher, like, which doesn't make any sense. There was a scandal a few years ago with the Carchofi alla Judea, the Jewish artichoke in Rome. All of these, and what it is again, you're talking about the chumrah over chumrah, the stringency over stringency. It's this view that that once you know it, you have to deal with it in a different way. Whereas received tradition, even I mentioned before, Rav Moshe Feinstein, this very famous halachic legal arbiter, who he even said, like, what are you going to say? My grandma wasn't even kosher. Like everyone didn't do that. But there was a decision made by some communities to stake that as a kind of an identity statement of difference. So what I would say, this is one of those moments where you would say, it radically changed in my lifetime. Whereas in the 80s, not a problem. 90s starts to be a problem. Nowadays, deeply problematic in some communities.
Okay.
So it gets more than that, but that's my lightning answer.
Sure. This is the lightning round. Kashrut of turkeys.
So that the fascinating thing, right, is turkey. The reason that it's celebrated for Thanksgiving, right, it's a bird indigenous to America. And the problem is just like the Hebrew Bible says, domesticated quadrupeds need to have split hooves and chew the cud. And it says fish or aquatic creatures, right, need to have fins and scales. Birds, it just says these are the ones you don't eat. We don't even know the translation of all of them. So you know that, but so then there becomes a tradition that maybe they're birds of prey. But I always point out that it only that depends on who you define what's the prey, right? Like to a worm, every bird is a bird of prey. And the rabbis have some definitions for what it is, but then there becomes this idea that, well, you eat birds that your family has a tradition of eating, which is great for chicken, right? Because you've had a family of eating chicken, a tradition of eating chicken. But unless your family, right, is a Native American, it grew up, like, you don't have a tradition of eating turkeys, right? But there's obvious reasons why it would be included amongst the kosher birds. But so for most, they say yeah. But there are some not. And then there's also a fascinating history about Jews celebrating Thanksgiving. There's an interesting chapter in a book by Beth Berkowitz where she talks about the history of that, which I often assign to students right before Thanksgiving, so that no one has ever done this to my knowledge. But I say, like, here, go home and talk to your family about Jewish law.
Listen, it's much more exciting than politics, starting a big argument about whether or not the turkey's kosher. Okay, four more quick lightning rounds, and then I'll let you finish with whatever you want. Giraffes, people are always told the sort of stereotype you heard in Hebrew school is that the neck is too long to shecht, but that is total baloney. So giraffes.
Okay, so if the ironic thing is the neck being long makes it super kosher, right? Because the whole point, if anyone has studied the technicality, if you look at Mishnah and Talmud Chulin, they talk about there's an upper and lower limit. And on most animals, the upper and lower limit, you can't see because I'm holding my hands, is kind of tiny. And a giraffe, it's huge because you have to hit below a certain point and above a certain point. And the giraffe, it's huge. So it's actually quite easy relatively, but their skin is tough. There's not much meat on them. Where are you going to get a giraffe? It's ridiculous. But are they kosher? Split hooves, chew the cud, easy to slaughter them in terms of you have a huge a target area as opposed to a sheep. But I'm not, again, don't quote me as saying that means everyone should go out and slaughter giraffes.
I will not slaughter a giraffe. I promise. There is a rabbi in Beit Shemesh. His name is Natan Slifkin, who's sort of called the zoologist rabbi, who I believe is part of a project to specifically have a meal every year with these foods that are sort of educated. Another one is grasshoppers. Of like, grasshoppers are kosher, but I've never been to a Shabbat meal, and I would be weird if you showed up to my house for a Shabbat meal and I served you grasshopper. But every year, just to keep this tradition going.
It's very easy to figure out the biblical kosher. The Bible spends much more time talking about what is the kosher standards for that than it is for birds. It just says it gives you criteria. It talks about it. Right?
Okay, 3 more questions. What is the debate about Hebrew National? Why do some people say Hebrew National is not kosher?
So it's That's a long, long story, but basically what it comes down to is internal politics of debates about different kosher certification agencies and what their practices are and what they allowed. Um, and then there's some internal personal dynamics that come into that. And there's some interpretations of law. So that's going to be my short answer, because to get more detail with that. So what I would say is it comes down to, and it's also a good example of the perception of, oh, Hebrew National, the kosher hot dog, right? But for the longest time, they were not actually certified kosher. And then even when they have been, there's debates of if they are or not. And that comes down to a whole bunch of the complex dynamics that can be part of communal debates about what is and isn't kosher.
Amazing. This is good. So everybody who has sent me in questions, these are all questions from listeners that, when I posted that I'm talking to you. So I will tell them that they have to, go do more research. The most Jewish
Great.
answer is, here's the short answer, go out and study. It's a lot more complicated. Two more
Exactly.
questions.
Yeah.
Prenatal vitamins or gummies that have pig gelatin in it.
Okay, so this actually, okay. Again, back to the question is how much does this help the life? Like, so number one, here's the easy answer. If there are prenatal gummies that do not have it and they're equally effective, obviously, but even going back to classical rabbinic literature, they talk about the idea of a woman who is pregnant and starving and craving pig, right? And it's Yom Kippur. And they tell first you let her smell it, then you let her dip her finger in the juices, and finally, if she's still like, I can't, I'm faint, I can't, you let her eat it. So the idea being that, right, you're supposed to live by the commandments, not die by them. So what I would say is, if that's the only option you have, like I have 2,000 years of tradition that say that's not a problem. Exactly in that situation where you have a pregnant woman who needs it for her child to thrive.
I thought that there was, and I should have probably looked this up before asking you. There are some opinions, I think most notably some Sephardi, rabbinic leaders who do say that because gelatin is sort of like a derivation off a derivation, it's no longer
Yeah.
considered pig. Because I remember you had this debate about marshmallows also of, are
Mhm.
marshmallows that, without a hechsher, right? Most
Mhm.
kosher marshmallows, if you buy them from, your local kosher market, they have, fish gelatin or
Right.
something in it. But then, are sort of real marshmallows kosher. And you do have some
Right.
Sephardi rabbis who will say gelatin is not actually considered pork products there as
Right.
well.
The question is, what is gelatin? And again, actually, I feel like I'm plugging all these books, but I'll go back to Roger Horitz's book, Kosher USA. He has a great chapter on gelatin, about the in America, the food chemistry and Jello, and the debates of what is gelatin. Is it a totally new thing, or is it something? At what point does it cease to be? And again, these are all the fascinating thing is all these things are fundamentally based in arguments that go back to the Talmud. But there's no way that the Talmud could envision modern food chemistry. But the question is what principles apply to it, and how are they to be interpreted in light of modern food chemistry?
Okay, so another modern food chemistry question. This is the last
Great.
question, and then I'll let you finish off. Lab-grown meat, whether or not it would be considered meat for all intensive halachic purposes. Can you have a cheeseburger finally?
Yeah. So again, it depends. So this is the I know this is an annoying answer, but you
You
got
would
to
make a
work through
great
few
rabbi.
things.
Are you sure you don't want to go into if academia doesn't work out?
It's so this is the interesting question. So you have to ask the status of it, right? So the debate is, does the animal, first of all, where does that substance come from? Does it come from does it have to be from a living animal? And then, so like you take a few cells off a living animal. Well, does that then violate the prohibition right against taking a limb from a living animal? And then other people say that's ridiculous. These are cells. Like cutting off a limb is a limb, but couple flakes of skin, no big deal. Then other people say, well, what, do you have to, if you think that it has to be from a living animal, do you have to slaughter it first? And if you slaughter it, does it have to be slaughtered according to kosher slaughter? And then if you say that, and then say, okay, now you're taking from it, then you'd say it's meat. But there are some who say, okay, you can take off cells. And in fact, if you don't slaughter it, it's because there's a company in Israel that wants to make it cells off of animal that hasn't been slaughtered, because they want to try and market it to vegans to say, look, no animal died for this. Like if you slaughter, even if you slaughter it once and then never again, it's still the original animal, was slaughtered. But so they said, okay, I'm going to take these cells off. And some say, well, that's ever mincha, that's a limb from a living being. And they say, no, it's not. And then one rabbinic authority says, okay, not only is it not limb from a living animal, because it's like transformed in, no animal died, it's something completely different. It's not even meat. So you can grow a steak and eat it, but it's not meat, so you can have it with cheese. So now you can imagine way back we were talking about confusing steak with chicken. You can imagine other people saying, well, this is steak with steak. This is ridiculous. How can you say that? But there's a legal origin. So I'd have to ask your interpretation about these various things. For me, I find it fascinating debate. And I find it fascinating that one can legitimately make that argument that it's not even meat, or make the argument that it is meat, or it's kosher, or it's not kosher, right? And trying to use those principles and apply them to modernity. And when one of these lobbies is willing to sponsor me, I will take an official legal stance on it. Until then, I will just point out all the different ways it can be interpreted.
Amazing. I'll also say, if anyone from the OU is listening, I will put an OU on the middle of my podcast, and then I wanted to thank you for taking the time. I also want to flag for listeners, that found this interesting, that maybe have never diving into debates about kosher. We probably covered less than 1% of not just any of the questions, but also the material. I mean, there is, writing upon writing upon writing about this, and the amount of total primary sources it would take to end up reading out, all of this conversation and all these answers would probably fill an entire bookshelf. I wanted to see if there was any, final thoughts that you had about any of this, anything specific. I'll give you the final word, but I really appreciate this was a lot of fun conversation.
I mean, my final word is exactly kind of what you're saying, which is these are fascinating debates. And I think it's important to realize that people have strong opinions about these. And that's actually part of the fun of it, the sit in the debate, but to see how people have, food is so fundamental to our being. We have to eat, right? And all cultures choose to not eat foods that are otherwise, edible, right? And so to take some time to think about what it means to eat, and what it means to you to eat, and what it means to eat with other people, and what you want to include or cut out from them, is fascinating. And so that's the thing I'm always trying to get people to do, is look at this rich tradition of that, and find that there's not one single answer. I think the problem is people this is the traditional answer. And I'm like, well, if you read the text, you find that there's no one traditional answer, and that traditional answer isn't as quite as traditional as you thought it was.
Yeah, well,
So
Professor, see, I accidentally called you Rabbi. Professor Jordan Rosenblum, thank you so much for talking.
Oh, thank you for having me.